The problem I want to talk to you today about, or the idea I want to talk to you about, is about how workers and companies might connect with one another in the future. And in order to understand my idea, let's think for a minute about cloud computing. So think about how cloud computing has changed enterprises, that you're aware of and around the world. But in the olden days, let's call them, companies had to buy hardware. They had to go out and find it, launch servers, and then they had to have people maintain those servers. And each of those servers had one specific job. And if they had too much computing power that was needed in any given day, that was just too bad. The servers would go down, and everyone would panic, and it was not good. Well, fortunately for all of us, along came cloud computing. And what cloud computing is at the highest level is where there's a big pool of shared resources, a big pool of a lot of hardware that sits someplace, and companies can tap into it and access it and use only what they need when they need it and pay only for what they need when they need it. And there's a group of people who maintains that hardware and makes sure that everything is up and running. So you can imagine how transformational cloud computing has been for the IT space. Well, imagine for a second if every job in the service sector was put into one big pool. Imagine if every employee that does a service job was part of one pool and companies could then tap into it just like they tap into cloud computing today, using just the right resources at just the right time. And I think that's, to me, a very inspiring idea. And it might seem like that's a very far-fetched idea, but believe it or not, that's already starting to happen. Let me tell you about a few of the trends that are driving us in this way. So today, it might be surprising, but 1 in 3 Americans are freelancers. So what does that mean? A freelancer is somebody who works for one or more companies and gets a 1099 and doesn't employ anybody else. So this is something that surprised me. This number is expected to grow to half of all Americans by 2020. So very, very big change in the demographic of how people work and how people engage with companies. In addition to that, by 2015, more than 1.3 billion people will work virtually. How many of you all know somebody who doesn't go to a traditional office at one company to work? Okay, so companies are accepting the fact that people no longer have to be in their 4 walls to be a meaningful part of their venture. And even more surprising to me is when you look at this statistic. So what is an online worker? An online worker is someone who's engaged by a company using only the internet. So they haven't met them in person, they haven't done a robust interview process. They go online, they find the person, they hire the person to do a job. In the next 10 years, payments to those workers will total $133 billion. That is absolutely massive. That means 10 years from now, $42 billion in payments will be made in 1 year. And you know what's even crazier? This is the first year that those payments will cross the $1 billion mark. So in the next 10 years, we are talking about a substantial shift in how the world works and how companies and workers connect. So let's talk about a few things that are driving this exponential growth in this space and the change. Well, the first that probably seems pretty obvious is connectivity. And you heard a little bit about that in the last talk, which was actually awesome. I really enjoyed it. But if you think about it, 20 years ago, the internet didn't exist. 20 years ago, I mean, imagine that. That's crazy. 10 years ago, social networks didn't exist. When I first went to college, I sent my first email the first week of my freshman year in college, and it was very odd. And I was like, man, this will never catch on. This is really difficult. Think about the way our lives are now and how connected they are. But when you think about the growth, this year, I guess by the end of 2014, it's not quite 2014 yet, 3.3 billion people will be connected. You just heard that there's 7 billion people on the planet. This year, there were more than 6 billion active cell phone subscriptions. So when we talk about connectivity, the world is becoming connected at an alarming rate. This year in the United States, 80% of households have an internet connection. In the developing world today, only 30% of households have an internet connection. So as this talk goes on and you think about the concepts here, one thing that's important to remember is this style of work not only creates opportunities for people in the United States and US businesses, but it creates a completely new way for people in the developing world to become a meaningful part of the job market. So as you hear those statistics about 1.5 million jobs that won't be filled, I think you can think about this as a way that that gap might be made a little bit smaller. Going on, what's the next big trend? How many of you know you're a millennial? Okay, so millennials are anyone who's born after 1980. That was really rude to ask you guys to reveal your age. Let's assume we are all millennials. So today, the population of the US workforce that is actually comprised of this group, 80 million workers, are about 30%. And so why is this important? Well, it's important because millennials, as you probably know, are very, very different. 37% of millennials would take a pay cut if it meant that they could have better flexibility and have a flexible location. So that's very different than the way the previous generation, the Gen Xers or the Boomers, thought about their career and work. Another stat, 81% of millennials, which is kind of funny as I present it, think that they should set their own schedule. Actually, as I was preparing this presentation, I was sitting in a room full of millennials, and they were all like, yeah, we should set our own schedule. And I was like, all right, well, this is about the future, not about now, all right? We're here. And on top of that, 30%, and this is the stat that's going to change things, 30% of millennials would leave their job if they got a better offer. So what does that tell us? That tells us that the way that millennials think about their relationship with a company is very, very different than the prior generation. If you look at this, the average company tenure of a millennial is 2 years versus a boomer of 10 years. So when we think about what this does to companies, it's very game-changing in terms of how they think about their human capital and how they access it. And this is something that is going to cause companies to have to shift how they do things in order to meet the demands of this new workforce with new ideas. Let's talk about Google for a minute. Google sees more than 1 million applications every single year. So I'd say they're arguably the most sought-after employer, at least in the United States. And of those 1 million applications that they see, they hire between 4,000 and 6,000 people. So let's say it's pretty competitive, right? When you look at a list of the Fortune 500 ranked by company tenure, Google, unfortunately for them, is at the top of the list on the opposite side of the scale where I think most companies would want to fall. Average employee tenure there is only 1 year. Amazon has the same stat. Amazon's 1.1. So when you think about how difficult that is for a company, I mean, imagine bringing somebody on, going through the training, doing that, and then having them turn around in 1 year. Why is that? Well, because Google's a very big name. It makes people more marketable. People don't think of themselves as tied to one company anymore, at least millennials. They think of themselves as a mini entrepreneur who can run around. Okay, that's a really bad way to say it. Who can move from job to job to job, bringing their unique skill set and getting compensated for it. And when you've worked at Google, let's face it, you instantly become more marketable. But this means something very special for companies. An average employee turnover at a company costs between $15,000 and $25,000, and this is across the Fortune 500. So when you think about how expensive that is for companies and how much turnover we're actually talking about, companies are going to have to change the way that they access labor and access work, or else it will become infinitely more expensive to operate just because of dealing with people who are ready to move on. Think about Zappos. Zappos has a very interesting program to try to combat this. If you all became new employees at Zappos, 6 weeks after starting there, well, you'd go through a training program for the first 6 weeks. And sometime around the 6th week, someone would sit down with you and say, gee, how's this training going? How do you feel about the company? Do you really believe it? Do you think you can do it? You know what? I'll offer you $5,000 to leave right now. They offer every new hire a bonus. They actually started at $800 when it first went into play. Then they moved it to $2,000. Then they moved it to $4,000. And recently, they've moved it to $5,000 for you to walk out the door without ever setting foot in your actual job. And that's because it costs them so much if you aren't committed to the ideals of that company for you to leave. They'd rather have you leave right then and there. So crazy things are happening to cause people, companies are adapting, they're changing, doing things very, very differently. Of the Fortune 500, only 7 companies now have an average tenure of 10 years or more. So, we're talking about something that's not just a little microcosm in the tech companies. This is across all of the largest companies in our economy. So what are businesses doing? Well, last year, 58% of businesses reported spending twice as much on online employees. So businesses are changing, they're growing, and they're using this new model to augment their workforce. Why are businesses doing this? Well, let's talk through these things. The first one, clearly, is more flexibility. When you don't have somebody sitting in your office, saying, hey, I need a new skill, you're not cutting it any longer, is a lot easier. They can cycle through people much more flexibly. If you think about it, we heard the story about the coding training that's going on, which is amazing. There are more than 250 development languages that are actively used by Fortune 500 companies today. So if you think about the skill needs of businesses and how quickly new software comes out, people who know this, know that. You look at the list of skills that people have on their resumes, they're ever growing, and the list of requirements that businesses have is also ever growing. So how do you get new skills in more quickly? Well, you use online hiring. You get exactly who you need. Don't train them. Bring in somebody who already knows. Let's do it quickly. This also widens the search network. We heard about the job gap. People in Europe couldn't find the workers they needed. People in Japan can't find the workers they need. Well, let's just look online. It doesn't matter if you're in Japan. It doesn't matter if you're in Europe. If you can do the job and you can speak my language, we can communicate and get it done. It frees up focus. One of the big things with cloud computing, I just read an article recently that talked about how cloud computing's changed IT organizations. And one of the more interesting changes is IT is no longer about maintenance. They don't have to just keep the ship running. They're now in charge of innovating because the cloud keeps the ship running. And so if you think about how companies can change what's happening in their walls, why not have your team who sits next to you be the innovators, the thinkers, the people who come up with the plans, and then have a force of online workers who are able to execute those plans? Interesting. Faster. Today, it takes on average 26 days to bring on a new hire across companies in America offline. But it's only 2.6 rounded up to 3 days if you're looking for an online hire. So you can move much more quickly. Businesses love this. In terms of who is going to be brokering these new relationships, well, there are already marketplaces that have sprung up where this is happening every day. Companies like Odesk and Elance they're posting about 300,000 new jobs every month on their websites. And there are millions and millions of workers who have signed up and made their services available. So this brokerage is already happening. Odesk is actually crossing the $1 billion in worker payments line this year. So this is a huge economy that's growing. But let's take a second and go back to that very first thought I brought up in this conversation. And that was about how this new idea where people might amass their skills into one big pool of labor and companies could tap into that. Let's talk about that for a minute and how that might work. So if you went to one of these companies, anybody in this room could do it. You could log on, tell them a little bit about yourself, your education, your skills, what you like to do. You might have to take some tests to prove your skills. And once you do that, you are now in. You're part of this cloud of labor that's available to companies. And so what might this look like? Let's talk. I'm going to give you an example because I thought about this and I said, in order to help everybody understand, I think it's really important to give you an example. There's a company called ThredUp. ThredUp is an online consignment shop. And what does that mean? That means people like you every day, when you get done wearing what you want to wear, can fill up a bag and ship it off to ThredUp. And they have a big warehouse where they receive all of these items in, and then they sell it online. But in order to sell it online, it has to be described, it has to be photographed. You have to know whether it's stripes or red or pink, because clearly consumers are not going to accept anything less in an online shopping experience. And so ThredUp doesn't know on any given day whether they're going to get 1,000 new items of clothing or 5,000 or 10,000. And so in the olden days, ThredUp would have hired a couple of hundred people who would have been there for the days that they get 5 or 10,000 items and been relatively idle on the days that they only get 1,000. They'd have to hire a head of volume, they'd have to spend a lot of money. Not anymore. Now they can tap into this shared pool of workers and only pay for exactly the work that they need when they need it. So what might that look like? Well, let's say you're a worker, you get up in the morning and you decide, hey, today I am interested in helping ThreadUp identify these pieces of clothing that are coming into their warehouse. So you log on, you say, all right, I'd like to work on this task. I'm gonna get paid 25 cents per item. And what do you see? You see a shirt and you can choose the pattern, submit it, and get paid your 25 cents. Well, the nice thing for ThreadUp is that not only are you doing this, there's 10,000 other people who are waking up that same morning wanting to do the same thing, and there's 5,000 writers who are interested in writing product descriptions, and there's 2,000 editors who are editing those product descriptions, and you know what? Their items can now get processed in near real time because many people are working on them. Whereas one person would have had to process one item in the old way, this new way of work allows work to be split up into small pieces where each person can be matched not only to what they're best at, but what they actually want to do. Better than that, this really aligns the interests of companies and workers. Why is that? Well, let me show you a couple of examples. For ThreadUp, this is actually a graph of the activity that they're putting through this type of system. You can see their average cost for the type of job I just showed you is 26 cents. You can see on any given day how many full-time workers they are using, and you can see how their volume changes. So for a company like ThreadUp, this is perfect. How do they control quality? You'd be surprised, but they have more than one person doing each of those tasks. And guess what? If those two people agree, you can be pretty darn sure it's right. And if they don't, what do? We ask a third person. And this model works. They also layer in items that they already know the answer to just to check and make sure you're doing a good job. So ThreadUp can know, today, my quality is 96.3%, and my cost per specific unit of work is 26.3 cents. How many of you who operate businesses can narrow your cost and your quality like that? How can that happen? It's software. It's amazing. It's good for workers too. If you think about it, for workers, they know exactly what they need to do each day, how they can work harder to get paid more, and if they're doing a good job, they get instant feedback. If they get them right, they know. If they get them wrong, they know. For companies, this is game-changing. So I challenge you today to think about, what if you applied your skills in this fashion? What if you became part of a cloud of workers and you gave your skills to the right company at the right time, worked less, got paid more, companies got better quality, lower cost, and a completely elastic labor force? To me, I think that's an extremely interesting idea, and I believe it can be something that really changes the world. Thank you.